Part 5 of McCloskey's 1983 article is entitled "The Rhetoric of Economics is a Literary Matter." So when she's saying literary here, she's referring, I think, in general terms to the idea that economics is literature. That is, it is a written form of communication that is intended to generate thoughts or ideas and to persuade an audience. In Part A of this section, we have McCloskey saying that even the modernist uses and must use literary devices. So here she's saying that economists really should examine the variety of arguments that they use. And to do this, she says, or she recommends, you could look to the disciplines of classical and modern rhetoric to identify the real means by which economists seek to persuade each other and perhaps the general public. So she's going back to classical rhetoric, which is Cicero, Quintilian, and others from the classical Greek and Roman period, but also modern rhetoric, which is departments of rhetoric or departments of communication or departments of discourse studies, which have sought to revive or retain the lessons from classical rhetoric and to update them for the modern period. The underlying point of, or a common underlying belief here, is that, for our purposes anyway, is to say that, well, on the one hand we have reality per se, fine, but we don't directly experience reality and simply report what it is. Reality is one thing, but the way in which we understand it and communicate to each other about it, try and convince each other about what its nature is always a discursive activity. It is always done through language. You can never talk about reality without talk. And so we need to understand the mechanisms at work, the linguistic or the discursive mechanisms at work, in order to better understand what we're doing and to get a better handle, perhaps, to get a better handle on reality. Okay. But she says this is not about, when we're going back and looking at classical and modern rhetoric, we shouldn't think that this is all about fallacy mongering. The reason she says this is because often you find in, say, for example, textbooks of logic back then and even today, you'll have a back end of the textbook which will often be fallacies. And these fallacies are so argumentum ad populum, argumentum ad baculum, and so on, that are regarded as, oh, these are defective modes of reasoning which are designed to trick people. And so she's saying, look, when we examine rhetoric, that's not what we're doing here. Whether an argument is fallacious or not really depends on the context in which the argument is being utilized and for what purposes it's being utilized. So, for example, if we were to take the case of the argument from authority, then we wouldn't necessarily say that, oh, well, this is always a fallacious argument. One shouldn't believe something simply because an authority figure states it. It depends on the situation. So we might say that if a climate scientist who has training in the natural sciences and has a PhD in climatology, for example, says that climate change is occurring, then we might say, well, I'm going to appeal to the authority of this climate change scientist And that would be perfectly reasonable to do. That wouldn't be fallacious reasoning in that case. It would be fallacious reasoning if you said, well, Fred Nurk, who's my best friend, says there is climate change, so I'm going to believe there's climate change. McCloskey then goes on to give an example. So she takes Paul Samuelson's 1947 book, Foundations of Economic Analysis. In fact, she only looks at just a couple of pages. Probably the reason she's chosen this book is because this is one of the most important books in the history of economics in the 20th century. So it helped change the course of economics to put it on a more mathematical footing. Anyway, so when she looks at just a couple of pages from this book, she's able to point out that there's a number of literary devices being utilized here. And she doesn't want to say, she's saying, no, we're not doing fallacy mongering here. There are literary devices at work, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with those, and that they actually perform an important function. So, just quickly going through them, she notes that there's a good deal of sophisticated mathematics, and she says it's actually more sophisticated than you really need to make the point that Samuelson is making. Why does he use this overly sophisticated mathematics? Well, he's attempting to generate some kind of reputation or authority for himself. Say that he has a certain skill set which is unusual and advanced and something to be admired. So what he's doing is, Samuelson here, by using unnecessarily sophisticated mathematics, is that he's actually establishing ethos and demonstrating some kind of intellectual virtue here, which is potentially persuasive to an audience. He appeals to authority. So he makes reference to some famous economists of the time. He refers to J.R. Hicks and Frank Knight, for example, John Maynard Keynes. He even appeals to Aristotle. So these are appeals to authority. Right? It gives weight to his argument. But McCloskey points out this isn't some kind of just a rhetorical trick, but rather is actually something that's necessary for scientists to do, because, as she notes, no scientist can redo every previous argument. At some point, you're going to have to appeal to the authority of someone else. It also means that it's also persuasive in the sense that it indicates that you're not just, pulling things out of thin air, but you're appealing to a tradition and you're appealing to great minds who have come before you. All right. The relaxation of assumptions is to be taken seriously as comments on the actual world. So this is a case where McCloskey classifies this. I think most economists wouldn't have thought about relaxing assumptions in this way as a kind of a literary device. But McCloskey is saying it is a kind of literary device. So, for example, you might think, so if you relax assumptions, and this happens in all of science. So you've got Galileo thinks of a perfectly round steel ball rolling down an inclined plane where you're assuming there's no friction. And then you could say, well, let's now relax the assumption of there being no friction and see what conclusions that we come to that would be relevant to the real world, to kind of an engineering case where friction obviously is part of the real world. And similarly, in economics, we can do the same sort of thing. It has persuasive power. We could say, oh, well, up to now we've assumed that all of our decision makers in a market have perfect knowledge, but let's now relax that assumption and introduce the idea of there being uncertainty on the part of the decision-making agents. And let's see if we can deduce some conclusions from that. Again, that idea has persuasive power because we might start off with something ideal or idealistic or an idealization, which everyone recognizes is not real. Relaxing the assumption, and an assumption which everyone or most people would say, yes, that's plausible. That's a reasonable thing to do, and whatever we can deduce from that might be more relevant to a real world in which we would say, not everyone knows everything all the time. So it's a kind of, it's a persuasive device, in a way. Samuelson also appeals to hypothetical toy economies from which practical results are derived. So this is something that always happens in economics. If you've done first year microeconomics, for example, or first year principles of economics, in the first or second week you'll be introduced to a toy economy, the production possibility frontier, in which we assume we've got a limited number of resources available to us, we've got fixed technology, we've got fixed knowledge, and we'll assume we've only two types of goods are being produced in the economy. This is obviously a very, very simple toy version of an economy. It's not remotely realistic. But nonetheless, by constructing this toy, we can then manipulate it in various ways to deduce conclusions which we might say, oh yes, I can see how that would be true in the real world, despite the toy not being a completely accurate description of the real world. So if we've got our production possibility frontier, we can then say, what if there were technological innovation? What is likely to happen to the production possibility frontier? That is, what's likely to be the case? We'll be able to produce more of these two goods than before? Less than these two goods than before? What? We can make deductions about that which are plausible. Incidentally, it's more. Or what if there were a discovery of new resources? Then what would happen to the production possibility frontier? Would our economy be able to produce more goods than before? Or what if we decided to invade another country and take its resources? What would happen to our production possibility frontier? So you can start to tell stories which in some way connect to reality. Of course, invading other countries is not something to acquire their resources, not something we would do anymore, and that's, utterly barbaric. But, you can get the idea that, oh yes, I could imagine how that could be relevant in the real world. And McCloskey goes on to say that this is no Ricardian vice if done reasonably, as I've tried to indicate. By incidentally, Ricardian vice here means, it comes from David Ricardo. Well, it's referring to the political economist David Ricardo, who would write up a set of very, very restrictive assumptions, and it's a Ricardian vice in the sense that you've made assumptions which are so restrictive that you virtually guarantee that conclusion, irrespective of how unrealistic or implausible those assumptions might be. So McCloskey is saying hypothetical toy economies don't necessarily have this vice if you do it in a reasonable way. McCloskey doesn't specify what a reasonable way would be, but so be it. And then, lucky last, the use of analogies. So Samuelson uses analogies of various kinds. And McCloskey points out that analogies are pervasive in economics. And she'll go on to talk about that a little bit later. But she just gives a few examples of Samuelson using analogous terms of analogy. So transaction friction, yield spread, securities circulating, money withering away. Obviously, friction, spread, circulating, withering away, these are terms of analogy. Okay, so these are, she's just saying here, look, if we just look at just these couple of pages from this highly mathematical text, which is widely regarded as one of the foundation stones of modern scientific economics, we can see there's a variety of these literary or rhetorical devices at work that are not illegitimate, but they are actually necessary to the text. If you took them out of the text, you're left with, you've basically destroyed the text, and it doesn't have the same persuasive power as it otherwise would. Part B of this section is most of the devices are only dimly recognized by economists. And here she basically gives a list of devices that can be persuasive. So example is which is used as a kind of analogy, can be very persuasive. So for example, this is not an example that McCloskey uses, but say Gary Becker once talked about how he was driving to some meeting or other, and he came across a car parking space, or a space where he could park, but it would have been parked, the car would have been parked illegally. And he had to make a decision, will I park in this illegal parking space and potentially get a ticket, but I will be able to make the meeting on time, or should I continue to drive around and find somewhere legal to park, and then avoid a ticket, but I'll get to the meeting late. So he says what you could do is you could kind of make do a little cost-benefit analysis to figure out what would be the right decision to make for you. And he decides, well, I'll park in the illegal parking space. I think, the fine that I would get multiplied by the probability of getting that fine, the cost of that would be less than the benefit of arriving at the meeting on time. Okay, so this is a little story that he tells, a little example, and then says, well, this is analogous. We could use this as an example of criminal behavior. It's all about making cost-benefit decisions. So that's an example that could be persuasive, that McCloskey says economists use these all the time. Verbal suggestiveness is another device, and so you could have the example, the economy is basically competitive. So what do we mean? The economy is basically competitive. McCloskey here is saying that this is, when an economist writes something like this, they might not be saying this is a literal description of a particular market or of an economy, that it's basically competitive. It's not describing it, but rather she says that this could be thought of as more of an invitation or an instruction on the part of the author to focus on X, whatever this is. So focus on particular aspects of the economy as particularly important. Right? So there's not many, there's no monopolies, for example, or there's very few oligopolistic markets, for example. It's not saying that this economy is literally the same as the textbook theory of perfect competition. So it's suggestive of certain features of the economy that should be focused on. That's what you mean by verbal suggestiveness here. Another literary device is, she calls philosophical, and that term is just being used loosely here. Philosophical consistency. So if you accept X, then to be consistent, you should also accept Y. An example of that, and again, this is my example, not McCloskey's. An example of that might be, again, let's go to Gary Becker, where Gary Becker says, look, if you accept that in the marketplace, the consumer is a rational utility maximizer, then shouldn't you, to be consistent, shouldn't you also accept when that consumer goes home, they remain a rational utility maximizer? That is, they weigh up the cost that when they go into the marketplace, they weigh up the costs and the benefits of buying an additional Mars bar or whatever. And then when they go home, they weigh up the costs and the benefits, whether they should do additional washing up or something like that. So this is it's a rhetorical device that's designed to persuade an audience to think in a new way about some phenomenon or other. Reputation may determine whether an explanation is regarded as ad hoc or not. In economics, ad hoc explanations generally have very low status. In fact, it can be a term of abuse to say, oh, well, that's just an ad hoc explanation. What economists normally mean, and perhaps in other disciplines as well, when that kind of phrase really means something like, you just pulled that explanation out of your ass. Or, you just added that additional variable because it improves the statistical significance of your findings or something like that. You don't have any really good theoretical reason for this explanation. So McCloskey's saying that whether that term of abuse comes into play or not can partly depend on issues of reputation or issues of what's regarded as acceptable at the time. This is another example that McCloskey doesn't give. I'm just making it up, so to speak. Is that John Maynard Keynes says that households will have a certain minimum standard of living which they will seek to maintain. So they'll have a certain level of consumption which they will engage in irrespective of their level of income. And then as their income goes up, for each additional dollar that the household obtains, they will spend a certain percentage of that, a certain conventional percentage of that, say 80% of that they will spend and the other 20% they'll save. And why do they do that? Well, this is just their psychological habit. This is just their psychological propensity. Now, that, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, was an acceptable explanation of the marginal propensity to consume being less than 1, say, and being relatively stable. But today, it's very often the case that economists will say, well, that's just an ad hoc explanation. That's not backed by any substantive theory, just saying, oh, well, that's just people's psychological habits. It's not built on for example, a theory of utility maximization or something like that. So whether something is regarded as ad hoc or not will depend partly on reputation at the time and what's regarded as an acceptable explanation or move at that particular moment in time. And lucky last, theoretical simulations. So this is something that happens in economics all the time, where you'll construct, like a toy economy or a toy version of a market, a theoretical market, and then say, what if we changed X or Y? What if we changed this? What if we manipulated it in this way? What would happen? Right? So it's a thought experiment. It's not something which has actually happened. It may never happen, but we do a counterfactual. We say, well, if this had have happened, or if this were to happen, then X, Y, Z would follow. So we might say, if we were to increase the minimum wage by some amount, then this would follow. Unemployment would rise. Or I can construct another theoretical simulation and say if the minimum wage were to rise, this would have no impact on the unemployment rate. We have different theoretical simulations. even though they're not necessarily backed by any empirical evidence of what's occurring, because they are just thought experiments. They're about things which haven't happened. But nonetheless, they may be persuasive. And there can be all sorts of different theoretical simulations. So McCloskey says they can be very simple ones, back of the envelope, drawing demand and supply curves, and playing around with price controls, or imposing a tax on buyers or sellers. And then we could think about, okay, where does the incidence of tax fall predominantly, on the buyers or the sellers? Or it could be a very, very elaborate theoretical simulation. So a computable general equilibrium model of an entire economy, where we say, what if so you construct this elaborate theory consisting of hundreds and hundreds of equations, and then you say, well, what if the government were to impose a tax hike on household incomes by a certain amount, but it also increased its expenditure on infrastructure. And at the same time, let's say there were a fall in the exchange rate. So this is a hypothetical or imaginary scenario, and you can crunch through the vast model to project certain kinds of outcomes, to say GDP growth, inflation and unemployment, for example. McCloskey says these are really literary or theoretical literary devices, or rhetorical devices, in the sense that they're not really deeply grounded on empirical observations of the world, but nonetheless they can be very compelling to economists.